Good evening. Tonight, what we want to talk about is the consumer decision process or consumer behavior, if you want to take a look at it that way. Now, think about this. Every day, you as a consumer make dozens of decisions to purchase or not purchase products. How do you do it? Well, in a sense, you consistently use the same 5 steps. First off, you have a recognition that there's a need you need to solve. It could be you're thirsty. It could be you're hungry. It could be you've got a job interview and you need a new outfit. It could be you want to impress somebody. Maybe your parents are coming to town. The next thing you do is an information search. Now, how much you search really depends upon how big a need and what kind of need that purchase decision represents. If it's something simple like I'm thirsty, you may go, oh, it's middle of the day, I'm passing a vending machine, I'm just going to buy a Coke or a Pepsi or a bottle of water. Or I'm just going to go and fill my water bottle up. Okay? Those are very habitual decisions or low involvement at the most. The more the purchase decision is important to you, the more you're going to search. And we'll talk about that later in this chapter. Once you decided you're going to do an information search, you'll come up with a list of alternatives. And every marketer, no matter what they're selling, has one common alternative their consumers consider. That common alternative is do nothing. No consumer has ever gone wrong, ever had a bad experience from doing nothing. Now, doing nothing doesn't mean they decide not to buy. It could, but sometimes it doesn't. It could mean that doing nothing means they just do what they always do. So if whenever you're thirsty, you pick up your water bottle, walk to the nearest fountain and fill it up, that's a great example of do nothing. Did you go through a big information search? No. You said thirsty, habit, water, fountain, fill, boom, I'm solved. Okay? So one of the things we always have to overcome, we want consumers to change the way they do things. By changing the way they do things, that means buying our product or our service. We have to overcome the do nothing. Now, if you remember studying physics, physics talks about one of Newton's laws, and Newton's law says that a body at rest stays at rest. You have to figure out a way to get that body to move. And that's going to require a lot more effort on your part as a marketer to get them to change than it does to get them to stick with what they like doing now. So, as you go on, you've got to start to figure out, okay, what do we need to do better than the alternative, than the do nothing, so that they'll purchase us over doing nothing. And that takes us into consumer research, which we'll see in the marketing research chapter. So if you think about it, that's twice in the last 2 chapters that marketing research has been mentioned as important. To my mind, marketing research, consumer behavior, and promotions are probably the 3 most connected areas in marketing. What we do is we use consumer behavior to develop a theory about the way we think consumers are going to act. We test it using marketing research to see if they agree with it and how much they agree with it. And then we implement it usually using some form of promotion. So we're going to see how that connects up. So to go back to what we're talking about, decision-making process. Number 1, need recognition. Number 2, information search. Number 3, people evaluate the alternatives. And we'll talk about how they do that. Number 4, they purchase. And number 5, there's the post-purchase evaluation, the post-purchase behavior. And that's every bit as important as what comes before it. And a lot of marketers fail to realize that. So what happens is the customer buys the product, and then they have a case of buyer's remorse, or as it's called, dissonance. If the marketer doesn't deal with it, the consumer becomes upset, and that means your odds of getting a sale the second time are vastly lower. So we'll talk a bit about how companies use that, how marketers use that. Okay, let's start with need recognition. How do you know you have a need? Well, a need occurs whenever there's an imbalance between what's a perfect state or a desired state for you and an actual state. Take the basic one, I'm thirsty. Well, your throat's dry. Maybe you've got a bit of a headache from being dehydrated. There's something that tells you you need something to drink. That's the desire. That's the current state. The desired state is to get rid of that. So what you do is your mind goes, oh, you need a drink of something. That solves the problem. Okay? So what we want to do is figure out, well, how are things like that triggered? What's the trigger that tells somebody that they're out of balance? Well, the I'm thirsty, that's an easy one. That's an internal trigger. But sometimes it's an external trigger. So there are things we can do as marketers to get consumers to realize they need something. Now, we can't get them to buy something they don't want. But what we can do is we can trigger the thought process that gets them along the journey, that starts their journey. Great example of this is, if you notice, about between 5 and 6 at night and after 10, ads for quick service restaurants really pick up. Burger King, McDonald's, Wendy's, Sonic, all of those pick up at those two times. Well, why? Well, 5 to 6 is typically dinner time. They're really going after people who are starting to get hungry but haven't made a plan for dinner. And if it's a radio ad, we're catching them in their car so we can get them to move in. So what we're trying to do is, we already know they have that internal imbalance. Now what we're trying to do is direct them our way. Okay. Why at 10 o'clock? Well, at 10 o'clock, students like you are getting a little hungry. Maybe you need a snack after a hard night of studying marketing foundations. Or maybe you're just getting ready to go out for a night on the town and you're thinking about someplace to go after you've visited your local pub or your local drinking establishment, wherever you want to go. So what we do is, we as marketers try and move you based upon that external. We put the so-called bug in your ear. We give you the theory to go after that, okay? Now, do all imbalances cause consumers to do something? No, they don't. In order for a consumer to do something, we have to move the bar, either through the external push by showing them a promotion or giving them a sample of product to get them to purchase, or through an internal piece. You could be sitting there going, I'm hungry, but if you're not hungry enough to get off the couch and go to the nearest quick service restaurant, we could show you 1,000 commercials and you still wouldn't do anything. Okay? So the imbalance has to be high enough the consumer really wants to do something. The next step is information search. Consumers typically do two types of information search. The first one is internal. Remember we talked about that they tend to do the same thing over and over again, the do nothing approach? Well, what they do is most consumers go, oh, last time I did X, I didn't mind that. I'll just do it again. That's an internal search. But 80% of all purchases, internal search. What was my last experience? Great, I'll do that. Did I like it? Yes, fantastic, okay? Then there's external information searches. The more complicated a product is, or the infrequency with which we buy it, the less frequent we purchase a product, the more we tend to do an external information search because there's some risk associated with it. So what we do is, if it's let's say we're buying a house or we're buying a car, we tend to do a lot of online research. We might ask our friends. We'll do a lot of searching because we're worried about that purchase. It's a big purchase for us. It's got a risk associated with it. Okay. The risk comes into one of three levels. One's a personal risk. So if you're buying, let's say, a new chainsaw, you may ask your friends who've got chainsaws which ones they've got because you're worried about, accidentally hurting yourself with the chainsaw. So you want to know, does it have all the safety features attached to it? An auto cutoff or something like that. Okay, that's a personal risk. And could be if you're thinking about having maybe LASIK eye surgery, you probably would do a lot of work with that too, a lot of external searching on that because it's your vision. You're worried about the personal risk associated with that. We also worry about the financial risk. The more expensive an item is, the more we tend to do an external search. So houses, cars, dress clothes, we tend to do a lot of asking around to find out if it's the right purchase for us. Again, talking to friends, doing internet searches, maybe looking at some influencers, because what we're trying to do is lower the risk that we purchase the wrong thing. And especially if it's a car or a house, it's not like you can return it tomorrow. And last but not least, there's a social risk that consumers always think about. Will people think poorly of me if I purchase this particular product or service? Very important when it comes to things like clothes, also vehicles, anything where your friends can come and have a look and you're worried about what kind of conclusion they'll draw about you based upon what you're driving, what you're wearing, what your furniture looks like. All of those issues come into the perceived risk. We take a look at consumer confidence. The less confident a consumer is, the more likely they spend doing an external search. Now think about that. When you're buying the first of anything, you probably ask a lot of people because you don't want to make a mistake. It could be for financial reasons, personal reasons, social reasons. As you gain experience, though, you tend to ask fewer people because you have built up confidence in your decision making. Your product experience. After you've bought a few things, you understand how the system works, you figured out what the risks are, how to lessen them. All of those things help you as a consumer. And last but not least, the level of interest in the product. The more interested you are in the product, the more likely you are to spend time on it because it's important to you. So if you take a look at when you buy an article of clothing, you tend to spend more time on that than you would purchasing a roast at a grocery store, even though they both may cost about the same thing, because the article of clothing is of much more interest to you than the quality of the roast for the most part. Based upon that information search, you come up with what we call the evoked set. Those are the options from which you're going to choose. And that takes you to the next step. How do you evaluate them? To buy or not to buy? And what we have to look at is, what are the decision points consumers use? What are the benefits they're looking for? How are those benefits being met or not met by the competition? And then marketing towards those. So remember when we talked about in the SWOT analysis for Chapter 2, strengths and weaknesses. Well, here's where those come in. If you talk about the quality of your product is high, now that could be measured by the number of hours between failures. It could be measured by a thread count. It could be measured by whatever your industry determines is a measure of quality. That may be how consumers judge you. So if you say we have the highest quality product, well, you have to say why it's highest quality. How do you know it is? And that all comes back to consumers value this. Okay, let's take thread count. That's an easy one. You go to buy sheets. We always hear about the thread count in sheets. The higher the thread count, the better, because it means that the cloth is just that much better. Okay? Well, if that's an important piece, you try and put as many threads in as you can. The problem is once you get above about 500, it really doesn't matter anymore. 500 per inch doesn't matter anymore. But consumers still perceive there's a difference. So that's why you see people going 650, 800 threads per inch. Does it mean anything from a pure quality perspective? No. Does it mean something from a consumer perspective? Perception perspective. Consumer perception perspective? Absolutely. And that's why you do it. Okay? So once you've got that, you've got the alternatives. Consumers now take a look at all those alternatives and they decide whether they're going to buy or not. And they either buy your product or they don't buy your product. Well, here's where marketing research comes in again. If they don't buy your product, why not? What did you miss? We can test that out. Now they've got the product. They take it home. They're wearing it. They're driving it. They're sitting on it, whatever it is. The one thing as marketers we have to cut back on is cognitive dissonance, buyer remorse. We have to assure the consumer they've made the right decision. Car companies are great at this. A lot of the ads for cars are not to get you to buy the car. It's to convince you that you made the right choice in buying that Chevy or Toyota or Hyundai or whatever it is you purchased because it's got this number of awards, okay? Satisfied customers, customers that have switched. They're people just like your consumers. We're trying to convince them you have made the right decision. Car dealers will often call you a week or so after you purchase a car. Did you enjoy it? If you go and purchase something online from Amazon, you always get, and how satisfied were you with your service? They're trying to make sure that you're going to come back because repeat business is the secret to success. And to get the repeat business, we have to cut down on cognitive dissonance. So we work with that. Okay, we've talked about consumer behavior. Well, there's 3 levels of consumer involvement. At the bottom end is routine. Okay, that's a routine purchase. Most consumer purchases fall into this category. Okay, this is most of your grocery items, your personal care items. For the most part, we don't think about it. We've fallen into a habit. We go and buy the same thing over and over again. Here's 3 things that those things typically represent. One is the timeline is short. We think about it, we buy it very quickly. 2 is the cost relative to our income is low. And the 3rd thing is we only consider one option. So here's the do nothing approach at its highest, and that's like 80% of all purchases. Then we move up to what's called limited involvement. Here, maybe we're not happy with an existing product. Maybe it's a new product category to us. We need to decide what we're going to do. Well, our level of involvement picks up a bit. We're now a bit more interested, so we might do a little bit of research. Our timeline might not be immediate. It might be a week. We're going to buy something within a week. Could be an article of clothing, for example. The cost has also creeped up. It's probably a bit more expensive. So it's something where we want to make sure that we're going to make the right decision. It's not a high financial cost, but it's still going to hurt if we make a wrong decision. Where do we get the information? Again, it's mostly internal. We'll go back to things we've heard, things we've read, and decide from there. And we'll consider like 3 or 4 options. So if you're going to go buy, if you're a guy and you're going to go buy a suit, you might think of, okay, I'm going to buy maybe a Calvin Klein, maybe a Joseph Abboud, maybe a third designer. I'm going to look at one of those 3, a Hugo Boss, although that would be a different price point. But let's say you're going to look at a Boss jacket, okay? All of those come into play and you make your decision. So that's limited involvement. That's about 18% of all purchases, 15, 18%. The last 2 to 5% requires a lot of thought. This is stuff you don't buy on a frequent basis. Cars, houses, retirement plans, things like that. There's a lot of involvement in this case. You do a lot of searching, okay? The time span is long. You're talking now weeks to months to make a decision. The cost is high, okay? If you're thinking about buying a car, we're talking about a big monthly expenditure. Or if you're buying a house, same thing, big monthly expenditure. We're going to do a lot of searching, both internally and externally. If it's a first-time purchase in this area, a lot more external than internal. As we gain more experience, more internals. And we'll consider many, many alternatives when we're doing it. So when we look at the getting involved in the involvement side, or when we consider consumer involvement, we take a look at things like previous experience that we talked about. We talk about the social visibility. We talk about all the negative consequences, okay? Well, what does that mean to us as marketers? Well, if it's a high involvement purchase, we need to put out a lot of extensive promotions, and it has to be informative. Here's where we start to see content marketing, and we'll see that in the promotion chapter. Here's where we see a lot of personal sales. At the opposite end, if it's a low involvement purchase, where they're considering a few, here we need to put a stimulus in right when they're getting ready to buy, because at that point they've already committed to buying. We want to shift them from one choice to another because we know we're in their choice, we're in their decision segment. So that's why when you go to Sam's Club or Costco or a lot of grocery stores, they offer samples. We know if you give somebody a sample, there's like an 80% chance they'll buy the product. And if you put a coupon on it, it goes up to almost 100, okay? So what we try and do are things like that, where we give them a sample to get them in. We try things like limited availability, limit of 4, because that tells somebody that there's a limit on it. And people instinctively go, if there's a limit, it's got to be a great deal. I better buy it now. Okay? So we start to see all of those as we go through. Now, externally, what can influence you? Well, your culture. Okay? So not only the overall US culture, but also a subculture. We talked in the previous chapter about African American consumers, Hispanic consumers. Well, those are subcultures. How do they impact it? Social class. What class are you falling into? That will also impact the type of decision and the type of product you buy. Gain detergent, for example, was originally brought out to appeal to a lower social class because it was less expensive. What they found is that's moved into very much the mainstream because people have decided not to spend bigger money on brand names like Tide, and they're going to more of a Gain. It could be a social factor. Who are your influences? Who do you look up to? Well, here we go back to those influencers like the Kardashians. What are groups you want to be part of? Aspirational groups. What are groups that you think about as similar to you? That's a reference group. And do you have avoidance groups? Groups you don't want to be seen like, okay? And then there are individual factors. How old are you? You make different purchase decisions than I do because of our age difference. You make different purchase decisions if you have children versus if you don't have children. And the age of your children determines what kind of purchase decisions you make. That explains the rise of the minivan, okay? Your personality, those also go into it. There's also the whole concept of psychology plays a role. That as consumers, we're bombarded by tens of thousands of messages every day. So as a marketer, we've got to figure out a way to cut through that. That's called getting through the selective exposure. So we have to know what triggers the consumer to pay attention to us. Then we have to contend with what's called selective distortion. Consumers take information and they bend it to fit their vision of reality, what they know, their internal and external information from over the years. That's called selective distortion. So we have to find things that fit with what they're interested in and follow the narrative they're using. And then we contend with selective retention. You as students know you don't recall everything in the book. That's why we do the quizzes, just to see how much you do remember. But there's selective retention. People only remember the stuff that's important to them. So we have to figure out, of all the things consumers consider when purchasing a product, what's most important, because that's what we want them to remember when they're deciding us over somebody else. Okay? The book talks about motivation, it talks about learning, it talks about beliefs and attitudes. If I were you, give those a read, because what you want to do is understand how we try and coach consumers, we try and teach consumers how to do things, and how different companies use Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which you'll see 1,000 times in your university career, to market products ranging from smoke detectors to cars. To really help you out, what I've done is I've posted a video for you. And this video is produced in Canada, and it looks at the ways grocery stores, because they're some of the best at this, how grocery stores stimulate you as a consumer to make specific decisions. So what I want you to do is have a look at that particular video and keep in mind it's fair game for the exam that's coming up end of the week. And that's it for now. I'll talk to you on Tuesday.